Try beating me, sweetheart. Vanessa Kessler let the words hang in the air, then looked Maya Coleman up and down like she was pricing a used car. Boots. Where's your lawyer? Oh, wait. That blazer is what passes for a lawyer these days. Laughter rippled through the gallery of Courtroom 4B. Boots. Somewhere in the back row, a court reporter's fingers paused over her keys. 27 years undefeated, Vanessa said, loud enough for the bailiff to hear. Boots. 27 years, and now I'm supposed to break a sweat over a paralegal from legal aid who filed her own paperwork. Boots. She reached across the table, pulled Maya's slim navy folder toward her, flipped it open with 2 fingers like she was handling something spoiled, and let it drop shut again. Boots. This is what you brought. A coloring book would have more legal theory in it. Maya didn't move. She didn't blink. Boots. Are you finished, Mrs. Kessler? Her voice was even, almost gentle. I'll present my case, and I will win. Vanessa smiled the way people smile at something they've already forgotten. Boots. Sure you will, honey. Let's see how far that gets you. What Vanessa Kessler did not know, what she could not have known, sitting there in her $4,000 suit with 27 consecutive verdicts behind her name, was who this woman actually was. Boots. Or what was written inside that scuffed navy folder. Or why, 40 minutes later, a judge who had not shown a flicker of emotion on the bench in 29 years would rise slowly from her chair and make the entire courtroom go still. Boots. But to understand that moment, you have to go back 6 weeks. Back to a 2-bedroom apartment on Seneca Street in West Charlotte, North Carolina, where none of this had started yet. And Maya Coleman was just a woman trying to keep her daughter fed, and her rent paid on the 9th of every month. Boots. It was 5:52 in the morning when Maya's eyes opened on their own, the way they always did now, before the alarm, before the sound of the city buses grinding down the block. Boots. She lay still, staring at a water stain shaped like Ohio on the ceiling above her bed, and let herself have 30 seconds of nothing before the day started demanding things from her. Boots. She was 34 years old. There were 2 silver hairs at her left temple that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Boots. Her hands, when she finally sat up and swung her feet to the cold floor, were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing people noticed about her, the stillness. But her jaw carried a tightness that never fully let go, even in sleep. Boots. In the kitchen, she cracked 2 eggs into a pan that had lost half its coating, and the apartment filled with the smell of butter and the instant coffee she allowed herself, because the good stuff was $11 a bag, and $11 was a bag of Zora's soccer socks. Boots. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. Outside, a city bus sighed to a stop at the corner of Seneca and Beale. Boots. Mama? A small voice, thick with sleep. Zora stood in the hallway in a yellow nightgown, dragging a 1-eared elephant by its trunk. Boots. Morning, baby bird. Maya knelt and Zora walked straight into her arms the way she always did, like gravity worked differently for the 2 of them. Boots. Maya kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of coconut oil and sleep, and began the ritual of braiding, 2 neat cornrows, tight against the scalp, finished with small yellow beads that clicked together when Zora shook her head to test them. Boots. Perfect, baby bird, said the 8-year-old, admiring herself in the microwave door. Perfect. 7 years old going on 40, Maya thought. And for 4 minutes at that kitchen table, with eggs going cold and the radio playing low, everything in the world was soft and simple and entirely hers. Boots. By 7:20 they were out the door, 4 blocks to Isabella Wilkerson Elementary, past Ruiz's corner store where old Mr. Boots. Ruiz always had a peppermint waiting in his shirt pocket past the laundromat with the flickering open sign. Boots. Zora skipped ahead on the cracked sidewalk, backpack bouncing, and Maya watched her go with the specific ache that only mothers who have almost lost something seem to carry. Not fear exactly, but a kind of gratitude sharpened into vigilance. Boots. Then she went to work. The Mecklenburg Legal Aid Society occupied a narrow storefront on Beatty's Ford Road. 3 metal desks, 2 filing cabinets that didn't quite close, a coffee maker held together with electrical tape, and carpet so worn you could trace the path from the door to the intake desk like a footpath through grass. Boots. Maya was the senior paralegal. She answered the phones. She helped people fill out eviction defenses and custody petitions and restraining orders in handwriting that shook. Boots. Every single day, somebody else's emergency landed on her desk, and every single day she was, by any honest measure, criminally overqualified to be handling it. Boots. Her best friend Renata Boyd said it more than once a week, girl. You graduated top 3% from Yale Law. Boots. You clerked for a federal circuit judge, and you're helping Mr. Aldridge fill out a form because he can't read past a 4th grade level. Which, God bless him, but Maya, why are you here? Boots. Maya always gave the same answer. This is where I need to be right now. What she had never said to a single living soul except once at 2A. Boots. M. to Renata, 3 years and 1 bottle of wine ago, was why she'd left Washington. 4 years earlier, Maya Coleman had been one of the brightest young litigators at Halloran Voss, a 200-attorney firm 3 blocks from the White House. Boots. She'd clerked for Judge Wallace Pruitt on the 4th Circuit. Partners talked, in the particular hushed way. Partners talk about people they're grooming, about her making equity partner before 40. Boots. And then, on a Tuesday in March, a senior associate named Craig Denby walked into the managing partner's office and told him Maya Coleman had leaked confidential merger documents to a competing firm. Boots. It was not true, not one word of it. But it didn't need to be true, it only needed to be said. Boots. The investigation took 8 months. 8 months during which her access to client files was revoked. 8 months during which colleagues who had eaten lunch with her twice a week suddenly discovered urgent reasons to eat at their desks. Boots. 8 months of sitting in a glass-walled office with nothing on her calendar, watching people glance at her through the glass the way you'd glance at a car accident, quick, guilty, unable to fully look away. Boots. When it ended, she was cleared completely. No evidence, no wrongdoing, not even a formal reprimand. It didn't matter. The damage had already set like concrete. Boots. Her husband, a man who had once told her, at their wedding, that he'd never met anyone who scared him and made him feel safe in the same breath, stopped being able to look at her without seeing the version of her that other people had invented. Boots. The divorce was quiet and, in its own way, merciless. Maya packed 2 suitcases in Zora's car seat and drove 4 hours south to Charlotte, where her grandmother Eleanor had lived and worked and eventually died, and where nobody knew her name. Boots. She put her Yale Law diploma in a desk drawer, not because she was ashamed of it, because she wasn't sure, anymore, that the profession the diploma represented deserved to hang on her wall like proof of something. Boots. That was the life Maya Coleman had built for herself in Charlotte. Small, careful, safe, until the letter from Sinclair Development arrived. Boots. The property sat on a corner of Cherry Hill, a historically black neighborhood being swallowed, block, by glass condominiums with names like the Ashford and the Wellington. Boots. It was a squat brick building with a faded green awning and a parking lot where weeds had pushed clean through the asphalt in long green seams. Boots. Maya had inherited it from her grandmother, Eleanor Coleman, a woman who had spent 31 years as a court stenographer in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse and never once, in all that time, been promoted to a supervisory position for which she was, on paper, the most qualified person in the building. Boots. To most people, the lot was worthless. Boots. To Margaret Sinclair, a real estate developer with a portfolio north of $200 million, it was the final missing piece of a $65 million mixed-use tower called the Cadence. And without it, the entire project, already 3 years and $11 million deep in permitting, would collapse. Boots. Margaret offered $400,000. Maya said no. Margaret offered $350,000, with a tight, patient smile, the kind of smile that assumed the number was never really the point. Boots. Maya said no again, so Margaret sued. She claimed the parcel had actually belonged to her own family for 2 generations, based on a verbal understanding between her late father and Maya's grandmother. Never written, never witnessed, never recorded anywhere but, Margaret insisted, understood by everyone involved. Boots. And to make sure she won, Margaret Sinclair hired the best litigator in North Carolina, Vanessa Kessler, senior partner at Kessler, Wraith & Sims, 27 years undefeated in civil property litigation. Boots. When Vanessa learned her opponent in this case was a black single mother from legal aid with no attorney of her own, she actually laughed out loud in a partners' meeting. Boots. She turned to her second-chair associate, a 31-year-old named Trent Michaels, and said, "This one's over before lunch, Trent. Don't even bill for the afternoon." Boots. To understand Vanessa Kessler, you had to understand that she did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as exacting. Boots. She had grown up the daughter of a mill supervisor in Gastonia, who believed that softness was how people got taken advantage of, and she had built her entire career on the idea that the law rewarded whoever prepared hardest and blinked last. Boots. 27 consecutive verdicts had taught her that this theory was correct. It had never once occurred to her, in all that time, that the reason her opponents kept blinking first was that most of them couldn't afford to keep the lights on while they fought her. Boots. She called this standards. She called it protecting the integrity of the profession. Boots. She believed it with the same unshakable conviction with which some people believe in gravity, and it was precisely that conviction, never doubted, never interrogated, that would eventually undo her, because a woman who cannot imagine she might be wrong has no mechanism at all for changing course once the evidence says she is. Boots. Maya could not afford a lawyer. She called 6 firms that first week. 2 never called back. 1 quoted $22,000 just to file a response. Boots. The last one, a kind older man named Sol Feinberg, told her gently, "Miss Coleman, if Vanessa Kessler is on the other side of this, I'd tell you to save your money and find a way to make peace with losing the lot." Boots. Nobody beats Vanessa Kessler. So Maya decided to represent herself. She filed her answer on a Wednesday night, typed at her own desk at Legal Aid after everyone else had gone home, the fluorescent lights buzzing over her head. Boots. Renata stayed until 11 to help format the citations. It wasn't polished, it was clean, and it was complete, and it was hers. Boots. 3 days later, a courier delivered a thick manila package to her apartment door. 431 pages. Interrogatories. Boots. Requests for admission. Document demands with deadlines, 11 days apart. Deposition notices stacked 3 deep. Maya sat at her kitchen table that night, with Zora already asleep down the hall, the only sound the refrigerator's low hum, and a bathroom faucet she kept meaning to fix. Boots. She picked up page 1 and started reading. She did not stop until 1:47 in the morning. This was Vanessa Kessler's signature. Boots. Paper warfare. Bury the other side under so many documents and so many deadlines that they miss something critical, or simply break. Boots. Against a solo litigant, with no paralegal, no associate, and no budget. It was a slow, procedurally legal execution. Vanessa had used it dozens of times, on elderly homeowners, on single mothers, on a Vietnamese-American nail salon owner in a lease dispute 2 years earlier, who'd had to sell her shop just to cover the discovery costs. Boots. It had never once failed her. It was not going to fail her this time either. That, at least, was what she believed. Boots. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in the body right away. It shows up in the small things. The mug you leave in the sink for 2 days, the bill you forget to open, the way you stop hearing your own daughter the first time she says your name and only catch it on the 2nd or 3rd try. Boots. By the end of that first week, Maya was living inside that exhaustion. Boots. Legal Aid did not pause its caseload to accommodate her personal litigation, so her days were split in 2. Eviction defenses and custody hearings for other people's families from 8 to 5, and her own family's future from 8 at night, until whatever hour her eyes finally gave out. Boots. Renata started leaving containers of oxtail stew on Maya's desk without a word, because she'd noticed Maya had stopped remembering to eat lunch. Boots. On the 9th day, a second courier arrived. This one carried a letter, not from Kessler, Wraith and Sims directly, but from a property management company Maya had never heard of, informing her that her lease at the Seneca Street apartment would not be renewed at the end of the term, effective in 90 days, for unspecified business reasons. Boots. It took Renata exactly 1 phone call to discover that the management company had 6 weeks earlier been quietly acquired by a holding entity registered to a law firm's paralegal, one who happened to share a last name with Trent Michaels. Boots. Nothing about it was provably connected to the case. Everything about the timing said otherwise. Maya did not cry over that letter. Boots. She read it twice at the kitchen table, folded it into quarters, and placed it inside the Navy folder, on top of everything else. Boots. If they wanted a paper war, she thought, then she would keep every single page. 3 nights before trial, Vanessa Kessler called the executive director of Mecklenburg Legal Aid Society directly. Not Maya, but her supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Walter Ngo, who had signed off on every eviction defense Maya had ever filed. Boots. Vanessa introduced herself, mentioned, almost in passing, that the society received a portion of its annual funding through a state bar foundation grant that her firm's senior partners happened to sit on the board of, and suggested, in the gentlest possible language, that it might be wise for the society to encourage Ms. Boots Coleman to reconsider representing herself in a matter this far outside her, as she put it, current professional lane. Walter said nothing to Maya about the call for 2 full days, turning it over in his own mind, weighing what he owed her against what he owed 30 other clients whose services depended on that grant. Boots. When he finally told her, sitting across from her at his cluttered desk with the door closed, his voice was low with something between apology and fear. Boots. I'm not asking you to stop, Maya. I just need you to know what it might cost this place if you don't win. Boots. Maya looked at him for a long moment, thanked him for telling her the truth, and went back to her desk to keep working. Because stopping had never actually been on the list of things she was willing to do. Boots. Every night that week, after Zora was asleep, Maya sat back down at that same kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a black pen and coffee that went cold before she remembered to drink it. Boots. She read every page, answered every interrogatory, and missed not a single deadline. But Vanessa wasn't finished, not close. 2 weeks in, Maya received notice of her deposition, not at a neutral location, not at the courthouse, but at the headquarters of Kessler, Wraith & Sims, on the 31st floor of a glass tower on South Tryon Street. Boots. She arrived alone in her one good blazer, slightly too big in the shoulders since she'd lost 11 pounds she hadn't meant to lose that year. Boots. She carried a single scuffed navy folder, the same one that had belonged to her grandmother, its corners worn pale, EMC embossed in gold on the front cover that had faded to almost nothing. Boots. Her flats clicked against marble, so polished it looked wet. The receptionist glanced at her for exactly 1 second and went back to her screen. Boots. They walked her into a conference room the size of her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over the whole skyline. Boots. A mahogany table that could seat 20 ran the length of the room. Crystal water glasses stood in a perfect row, untouched, like they were part of the decor and not meant for drinking. Boots. At the far end sat Vanessa Kessler, flanked by Trent Michaels and 2 junior associates, who had clearly been told to say nothing and take notes. Boots. Vanessa didn't stand. Miss Coleman, have a seat. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I bill in 6-minute increments, so let's not waste either of our time. Boots. The deposition lasted 6 hours. Vanessa asked the same questions 4 different ways, watching for a crack. She asked about Maya's divorce. Boots. She asked, apropos of nothing relevant, whether Maya had ever been the subject of a workplace investigation, and when Maya's attorney objection, her own, spoken calmly, without an attorney to make it for her, was overruled by the transcript's own silence, Vanessa smiled and moved on, having planted exactly what she wanted planted. Boots. At hour 5, Vanessa leaned back and said, off the record, loud enough that it went on the record anyway, because the court reporter's fingers never stopped moving. Boots. You know, Miss Coleman, I looked into you, fired from a DC firm for leaking client secrets. That true? Boots. Cleared, Maya said. Fully cleared. No finding of any wrongdoing. Vanessa said, in a tone that made clear she'd already decided which version of the story she preferred, and it wasn't the true one. Boots. Interesting that you'd leave that off a resume if it's nothing. The room went very still, the first of the story's frozen moments, the kind where the air itself seems to thicken. Boots. Trent Michaels, 29 years old and 3 years out of Duke Law, looked down at his legal pad and did not look up again for a long time. Boots. He would remember months later that this was the exact moment something in his chest had gone cold and stayed that way. Boots. Maya said nothing. She opened her navy folder, made a single note in the margin in her grandmother's old handwriting style, small, tight, economical, and closed it again. Boots. That folder is going to matter more than you think, and it's going to keep showing up. Keep an eye on it. Boots. The trial began 5 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning in Mecklenburg County Superior Court, Judge Ruth Alden Whitfield presiding. 29 years on the bench, known throughout the North Carolina bar as the Iron Gate, a woman who had never once, in anyone's memory, shown a flicker of visible emotion from behind that bench. Boots. The gallery was fuller than anyone expected for a property dispute, mostly because word had gotten around Legal Aid and Cherry Hill that a lawyer from Beatty's Ford Road was about to go up against Vanessa Kessler, with nothing but a folder and a stack of yellow legal pads. Boots. Renata sat in the third row, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. In the very back, almost unnoticed, sat an older black woman in a gray wool coat, watching everything with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms without ever once being allowed to speak in one. Boots. Margaret Sinclair sat beside Vanessa at the plaintiff's table in a cream suit that cost more than 4 months of Maya's rent. Boots. When Maya walked in, alone, in the same blazer, carrying the same folder, Margaret leaned toward Vanessa and murmured something. Boots. Vanessa's mouth curled into the smile the whole city would eventually come to recognize from a single viral photograph. That was when Vanessa said it. Boots. Try beating me, sweetheart. Where's your lawyer? The opening hour went exactly the way Vanessa had scripted it in her head 1,000 times. Boots. She built her case methodically. A memorandum, purportedly written by Margaret's late father in 1987, describing a verbal agreement to transfer the Cherry Hill parcel to the Sinclair family once certain conditions were met. Boots. She called an expert witness, a document authentication specialist named Dr. Foster Aldridge, who testified with the smooth, over-rehearsed confidence of a man who had given this exact testimony in a dozen other cases. Boots. Then Vanessa escalated. It's a familiar pattern for the plaintiff's counsel to have to explain basic property law to opposing parties who represent themselves without proper training, Vanessa told the jury, not looking at Maya, though every word was aimed at her. Boots. We understand Ms. Coleman means well, but good intentions don't transfer title. She escalated again, an hour later, holding up a printout, a screenshot of a 4-year-old news article about the D. Boots. See firm's internal investigation, headline stripped of context. Your Honor, given the respondent's documented history with confidential and sensitive materials, we'd ask the court to weigh her credibility accordingly. Boots. Objection, Maya said, standing for the first time all morning, her voice utterly level. Relevance, and more importantly, that investigation resulted in a full and complete clearance. Boots. Counsel knows this. She said so herself on the record at my deposition. Judge Whitfield's eyes moved from Maya to Vanessa and stayed there for 3 full seconds, long enough that the court reporter later told Renata she'd felt the temperature of the room actually change. Boots. Sustained. Mrs. Kessler, you will not raise that matter again in front of this jury. Vanessa's jaw tightened for exactly a quarter of a second. Boots. Understood, Your Honor. She sat down, unbothered, already moving to her third escalation, the one she'd been saving. Boots. She called Margaret Sinclair to the stand and let her describe, in careful, rehearsed detail, a childhood memory of sitting in the Cherry Hill house, the house Maya's grandmother had lived in, while the 2 fathers shook hands over the deal. Boots. It was beautifully performed. 2 jurors nodded along, and that was the moment Maya opened the Navy folder for the first time in open court. Boots. She didn't rush. She laid 3 documents on the table in front of her, squared their edges the way her grandmother used to square a stack of trial transcripts before handing them to judge, and she stood. Boots. Mrs. Sinclair, she said, you testified that this meeting took place at 214 Loder Street in the spring of 1987. Boots. Maya slid the first document toward the bailiff. This is a Mecklenburg County plat map, recorded with the Register of Deeds. Boots. Loder Street was not renamed from Grantham Avenue until March of 1991. In 1987, the address you described did not exist. Boots. A ripple went through the gallery. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but her pen, resting on the legal pad in front of her, went still. Boots. Maya continued. The memorandum introduced as Exhibit 12 bears a notary seal from Commissioner Harold Pruitt. His license, according to the North Carolina Secretary of State's Public Registry, expired in October of 1985, 18 months before this document claims to have been notarized. Boots. Dr. Aldridge, she said, turning to the expert witness, you testified under oath in this courtroom that you have never had testimony excluded by a federal court. Boots. Is that correct? Correct, he said, a little too fast. Maya slid a 4th document toward the bailiff. This is a certified order from the Western District of North Carolina, filed 11 months ago, striking your testimony in Coleman v. Boots. Briggs Holdings for, and I'm quoting the court's own language, methodology that does not meet the minimum standard of reliability under Rule 702. Boots. Dr. Aldridge's face went the color of the folder in front of him. Boots. And finally, Maya said, her voice not rising, not once, throughout any of it. Finally, the plaintiff's own late father, in his own handwriting, in a letter dated the year before he passed, wrote the following to my grandmother, Eleanor Coleman, and I would like the court's permission to read it into the record. Boots. Judge Whitfield nodded once. Go ahead, Miss Coleman. Maya read 4 sentences. Boots. In them, Margaret's father thanked Eleanor Coleman for 30 years of friendship, apologized for a conversation years earlier in which he'd raised, half-jokingly, the idea of one day buying her corner lot, and stated plainly that he understood the land was hers, had always been hers, and that his family had no claim to it whatsoever. Boots. The room went silent in a way that felt structural, like the building itself was holding its breath. Margaret Sinclair's face drained of color. Boots. Beside her, Vanessa Kessler sat with a pen in her hand that had not moved in 90 seconds. That's not, Margaret started, then stopped, because there was nowhere left for the sentence to go. Boots. This is the part where you might expect the story to end. It doesn't. Not yet. Because what happened over the next 20 minutes is the part nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. Boots. Vanessa Kessler did the thing that would come to define the rest of this story. She did not concede. She did not pause to reconsider. Boots. Instead, she stood, adjusted her jacket, and pivoted directly at Maya. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of amateur theater I warned my client about. Boots. Ms. Coleman clearly spent weeks preparing a magic trick instead of a legal argument. It doesn't change the underlying merits of my client's claim, and frankly, I find it fairly insulting that this court is entertaining a performance from someone whose last job ended under a cloud of professional misconduct. Boots. There was one more thing Vanessa did that morning that never made it into any newspaper account, because it happened too fast for anyone with a phone to catch it on video. Boots. As Maya turned to gather her documents from the table, Vanessa leaned toward her, low enough that only the front 2 rows could hear, and said, You think a folder full of tricks changes what you are, sweetheart? Boots. Go back to answering phones. This isn't your world, and it never will be. In the gallery, a young paralegal from Kessler, Wraith's own office. A woman named Priscilla Odom, who had sat through 3 years of depositions just like this one and never once said a word, gripped the strap of her bag so hard her knuckles went white. Boots. She thought about standing. She thought about it for 1 full second, and then she thought about the rent she owed and the recommendation letter she needed for law school applications due in November, and she stayed exactly where she was, eyes down, ashamed of her own stillness in a way she would carry for a long time afterward. Boots. Objection, Maya said again. Quieter now, and somehow more forceful for it. Withdrawn, Vanessa said before Judge Whitfield could rule, which everyone in the room understood was not a retraction at all. It was a woman getting the last word in exactly the way she wanted it heard. Boots. Judge Whitfield removed her glasses. Mrs. Kessler approached. Boots. What followed, at sidebar, was inaudible to the gallery, but Trent Michaels, standing 3 feet away, closer than he wanted to be, would later tell Renata over coffee that he had never in 3 years watched a judge speak to an attorney the way Judge Whitfield spoke to Vanessa Kessler in those 90 seconds. Boots. He said her voice never rose above a librarian's whisper. He said it was somehow worse than shouting. When Vanessa returned to her table, her face was arranged into the same practiced calm it always wore. Boots. But her hand, Trent noticed, trembled very slightly as she reached for her water glass, and did not stop trembling for almost a full minute. Boots. Closing arguments began 40 minutes later. Maya delivered hers from memory. No notes, no note cards. Nothing but the folder closed on the table beside her. Boots. Your Honor, she began. The plaintiff's memorandum references a street that did not exist when it claims to have been written. Boots. It carries a notary seal from an expired license. It describes a meeting in a house that, according to county tax records, my grandmother had already purchased outright 4 years before this alleged conversation supposedly occurred. Boots. And the plaintiff's own father, in his own hand, confirmed in writing that this land has always belonged to my family. Boots. She paused. She let the silence do the work her voice didn't need to do. Mrs. Kessler walked into this courtroom believing that the size of her firm, the cost of her suit, and the color of my skin would decide this outcome before a single piece of evidence was entered. Boots. Her voice did not waver. Not once. She was wrong, and that was when it happened. From behind the bench, Judge Ruth Whitfield, 29 years on the bench, a woman who had sat through capital cases without so much as adjusting her posture, rose slowly from her chair. Boots. The room froze, every head turned, every whispered conversation in the gallery died mid-sentence. Somewhere near the back, a woman's breath caught audibly enough to carry. Boots. Judge Whitfield stood there for a long moment, looking directly at Maya Coleman, and the fluorescent lights above the bench seemed, for that stretch of seconds, unbearably loud in the silence. Boots. Then she nodded. Once. Please continue, Miss Coleman. Maya's eyes glistened just for a second before she blinked it away. Boots. Her hands, resting flat on the table, trembled almost imperceptibly. Her voice held, "No further argument, Your Honor. The evidence speaks for itself." Boots. Nobody moved. Then, from somewhere in the back row, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another, then a third. Boots. Judge Whitfield raised one hand, and the room fell silent again. But the message had already traveled to every corner of it. Boots. The judge did not wait long. She looked down at the documents in front of her. The plat map, the expired notary seal, the federal exclusion order, the letter in a dead man's own handwriting, and set her glasses on the bench. Boots. This court finds in favor of the respondent, Maya Coleman. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed, with prejudice. With prejudice. Margaret Sinclair would never be permitted to bring this claim again. Boots. It was over, permanently. But Judge Whitfield was not finished. She turned to Vanessa Kessler, and her voice, still quiet, carried to every seat in the gallery. Boots. Mrs. Kessler. In 29 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such open contempt, not for opposing counsel, but for the integrity of this court itself. Boots. You introduced a document you either knew or should have known was fraudulent. You called an expert witness, whose testimony had already been struck from the federal record, and you did so without disclosing that history to this court, which is itself a violation of your obligations as an officer of this court. Boots. You attempted repeatedly to introduce irrelevant and prejudicial employment history for the sole purpose of undermining a respondent who had every right to a fair hearing. Boots. She paused, letting each word land before the next one arrived. I am referring your conduct to the North Carolina's State Bar for a formal ethics investigation. Boots. I am additionally sanctioning you and your firm $41,000 for discovery abuse and courtroom misconduct, payable within 30 days. Boots. You will receive the written order by end of business today. Vanessa Kessler stood absolutely motionless. Her face went blank, not defiant, not angry, simply empty. The particular emptiness of a woman watching 27 years of reputation collapse in under 2 minutes. Boots. Your Honor, she said finally, I maintain that zealous advocacy on behalf of my client is not misconduct. Judge Whitfield did not even look up from her papers. Boots. That will be a question for the bar, Mrs. Kessler. Court is adjourned. Trent Michaels closed his laptop without a sound. Boots. He did not look at Vanessa. He stacked his files with unnecessary care, the way people busy their hands when they don't trust their faces, and he did not say a single word on the way out of the courtroom. Boots. In the hallway outside, Margaret Sinclair caught up to Vanessa near the elevator bank. Her voice, when it came, was low and shaking with a fury that had nowhere left to go. Boots. You told me this was guaranteed. You told me she was nothing. Vanessa said nothing at all. We're done, Margaret said. Boots. I'll be finding new counsel. And Kessler, Wraith is getting a bill from me for every wasted hour. She turned and walked away, heels striking the marble in short, furious steps, and did not look back once. Boots. Within 48 hours, the story had a life of its own. On day one, the Charlotte Observer ran a piece under the headline Single Mom from Legal Aid Defeats Undefeated Litigator in Stunning Property Case. Boots. Someone in the gallery had recorded 30 seconds of the closing argument on their phone, and it had already been viewed 400,000 times before the newspaper story even ran. Boots. A separate clip, Margaret Sinclair's hallway outburst, caught by a courthouse security camera and leaked by someone who worked there, included the line, muttered just before she stormed off, "That land is wasted on someone like her." Boots. That single sentence, isolated from context, spread faster than anything else that week. By day 3, the hashtag Justice for Maya was trending statewide. Boots. Legal commentators picked apart her cross-examination on video, calling it a masterclass. 2 of Kessler, Wraith and Sims's largest institutional clients, quietly terminated their retainer agreements within the same week, citing, in careful corporate language, a need to reassess alignment with firm values. Boots. By week 2, 3 separate former opponents of Vanessa Kessler had independently contacted the North Carolina State Bar. Boots. Each one described a strikingly similar pattern: aggressive personal attacks on unrepresented litigants, weaponized discovery designed to exhaust rather than clarify, and, notably, a disproportionate concentration of targets who were elderly, low-income, or people of color. Boots. The bar's preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation within 9 days. By month 2, the disciplinary hearing had concluded. The panel reviewed the deposition transcripts, the courthouse security footage, sworn testimony from 2 of Vanessa's former opponents, and Dr. Boots, Foster Aldridge's own admission, under oath, that Vanessa had known about the federal exclusion order and instructed him not to disclose it voluntarily. Boots. Her defense that aggressive advocacy could never, by definition, constitute misconduct, did not persuade the panel. Her license was suspended for 22 months. Boots. She was ordered to complete 250 hours of pro bono representation for tenants facing eviction in Mecklenburg County, plus mandatory ethics recertification, at her own expense. Boots. She never once said the word sorry, not to the panel, not to the reporters waiting outside, not months later to anyone who asked. Boots. A local reporter, 3 months after the suspension, tracked her down outside a grocery store in South Charlotte and asked, on camera, whether she had any regrets about how she'd handled the case. Boots. Vanessa looked directly into the lens and said, "I regret that this court chose theater over precedent." That clip, too, went viral, not because people were angry at it, but because of how plainly it confirmed whatever everyone already believed about her. Boots. 2 more former clients came forward that same week, one of them an 81-year-old widower from Gastonia, who had lost his late wife's family farm in a nearly identical discovery abuse campaign 9 years earlier. Too old now, and too tired, to do anything but tell his story to a reporter and finally feel believed. Boots. Priscilla Odom did not resign the way Trent had. Boots. She stayed at the firm through the transition, quietly, and used what she'd learned in 3 years of watching Vanessa Kessler to become, within 18 months, one of the most careful, most scrupulously ethical junior partners the firm had ever hired, the kind of lawyer who read every exhibit twice and disclosed things she didn't legally have to disclose, because she had once sat in a gallery and stayed silent, and she had decided she would never let herself do that again. Boots. By month 3, Trent Michaels had resigned from Kessler, Wraith and Sims. Boots. In his cover letter to the Mecklenburg County Public Defender's Office, he wrote a single sentence that a colleague later shared publicly, with his permission. "I watched someone with nothing beat someone with everything, on nothing but the truth, and I realized I had been standing on the wrong side of the room for 3 years. Boots. The afternoon of the verdict, Maya didn't go straight home. She sat in her car in the courthouse parking deck, engine off, windows up, hands resting on the steering wheel. Boots. She didn't call anyone. She didn't check her phone, which had already begun buzzing with more notifications than it had received in the previous 4 years combined. Boots. She just sat there, eyes closed, breathing. Then she leaned forward, pressed her forehead against the wheel, and cried. Not from sadness, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to relief, the specific kind of relief that only arrives after you've been holding your breath so long you'd forgotten what it felt like not to. Boots. Her phone, still buzzing on the passenger seat, lit up once more with a message from Walter No. 4 words, nothing else. Boots. You saved this place. She looked at it for a long moment, set the phone face down, and let herself feel, for the first time in 6 weeks, like a person who was allowed to simply be tired instead of afraid. Boots. She sat there for almost 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face, started the engine, and drove to Isabella Wilkerson Elementary. Boots. Zora ran to her at the gate the moment she saw her, backpack bouncing, yellow beads clicking. Mama, how was your day? Boots. Maya knelt and pulled her daughter into her arms, breathing in coconut oil and crayon wax and the particular smell of a 7-year-old who had spent the whole afternoon being exactly who she was, without having to prove it to anybody. Boots. It was a good day, baby bird, she said. It was a really, really good day. There is one more thing worth telling you, and it is the reason the Navy folder mattered from the very first page of this story to the very last. Boots. The older woman in the gray wool coat, who sat quietly in the back row of the gallery, the one who watched everything and said nothing, was named Odessa Marsh. Boots. 30 years earlier, she had worked beside Eleanor Coleman as a court stenographer in that same building, back when black women in that courthouse were allowed to record every word spoken in a trial, but were never, not once in 3 decades, permitted to argue one. Boots. After the verdict, she found Maya in the hallway, took both of her hands, and said only this: "Your grandmother used to say the same thing to every judge who tried to talk over her." Boots. She'd say, "Write it down, get it on the record. It'll matter to somebody, someday, even if it doesn't matter to you today." Boots. Baby, you just proved her right. 6 months later, the corner of Cherry Hill looked different. The faded green awning was gone. Boots. The weeds had been cleared from the cracked parking lot and replaced with a strip of new asphalt, and 3 parking spaces marked for clients. Boots. A fresh sign hung above the door in clean black lettering: the Eleanor Coleman Justice Center. Inside, folding chairs sat in neat rows. Boots. A table near the entrance held intake forms and a bowl of peppermints in honor of Mr. Ruiz, who had donated the first box himself. Boots. The walls had been painted a warm cream. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly. Some things, Renata liked to joke, refused to be renovated, but the carpet was new, and the room felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place people could exhale in. Boots. Renata stood by the door, greeting people as they arrived: neighbors, single mothers, an elderly couple, clutching a manila envelope of paperwork they didn't understand, the kind of paperwork that used to end, more often than not, with someone losing something they couldn't afford to lose. Boots. In the corner, Zora sat coloring quietly at a small table, and when a local news camera swung her way, she looked up, smiled for exactly 1 second, and went right back to her crayons like it was nothing at all. Boots. Maya stood at the front of the room in the same blazer, still slightly too big in the shoulders, and she smoothed it once before she spoke. Boots. Near the back of the room, in a folding chair by the window, sat Odessa Marsh, the retired stenographer, in the same gray wool coat. Boots. She came every week now, not to intake anyone, just to sit and watch people walk in scared and walk out with a plan. Boots. When Maya caught her eye across the room, Odessa gave her the same single nod Judge Whitfield had given her that day in court, and something about the gesture, small as it was, made Maya's throat tighten in a way 400,000 video views never had. Boots. "Welcome, everyone," she said. "My name is Maya Coleman, and I'm here to help. So here's my question for you, the one I actually want an answer to. Has there ever been a moment in your life when someone looked at you and decided, before you said a single word, that you'd already lost?" Boots. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, I promise you that. And if any part of this story reached something in you, even just a little, hit like, and share it with somebody who needs the reminder today, because the truth doesn't care about your zip code, or your bank account, or what kind of folder you're carrying into the room. Boots. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is show up prepared, stand completely still, and simply refuse to disappear. Boots. Nobody gets to decide what you're worth. Not their money, not their title, not the loudest voice in the room. Show up prepared. Keep standing. That's the whole game.